I have been a fan of The Daily Show since before I was liberal. Even back when I was conservative, like pretty hardcore conservative, I loved The Daily Show. And back then I talked about how nonpartisan Jon Stewart was, and that you could tell to a degree that he was kind of left leaning, but that he was very nonpartisan in his presentation. So I was watching The Daily Show earlier, it's Sunday, last week. I was watching The Daily Show, and Jon Stewart did an interview with Matthew Desmond regarding his new book, Poverty by America, which I haven't read. Um, just disclaimer with that, but the interview was very poignant. It was very eye-opening to me, not in that I got a lot of new information that I hadn't gotten before, but it was just another instance as I listened to the things that they were talking about where two sides just don't understand each other. And it was the whole reason for me starting the Bible study series that I did on this podcast, is that so much of the left doesn't understand the right. And not in a, I can't believe you could think like that, I can't believe you would do that. It just, they have no idea where they're coming from. They have a fundamental misunderstanding of their worldview. And as I was listening to this interview, I was like, it's just another instance of that. We don't understand each other, and we're completely unwilling to have a conversation so that we do. And you can make all the arguments you want about why you shouldn't try to understand somebody who's that evil, but I've been on the other side and I've heard that same argument, and it's not helping anyone. And so today, in that light, we're going to talk about capitalism, and we're going to talk about why evangelicals are so wed to capitalism, and we're going to talk about the Christian Nationalist movement and why it's so tied to capitalism. And I hope, because I know I'm not ignorant. I know most of the people who listen to my podcast are left-leaning, but I do know I have quite a few listeners who aren't. I hope that this podcast will promote discourse. This episode will promote discourse. I hope my podcast in general promotes discourse, because we have gotten to such a point in our society where all we do is we just listen to people, not even in the mainstream media anymore. That was bad enough when that was all we did, but now it's just social media 10-second clips, and we've forgotten how to think, and we've forgotten how to discuss, and we've forgotten how to do our own research. We think that watching a 10-minute YouTube video is doing some in-depth research. We've just forgotten how to be a thinking people, and to be empathetic, and to be understanding. We have devolved to such a low intellectual level. This is why we're where we are, because our emotional intelligence and our cognitive intelligence is at an all-time low. And so we just flow with whatever power that is currently at the forefront wants us to do. So let's talk about capitalism. I, as you know, if you've been listening to the podcast, grew up white, evangelical, Christian, conservative, Southern nationalist, just all the stereotypical right-wing things. Hi, welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Naomi, and this is Mosaic in Progress. Today we are talking about capitalism. I read The Wealth of Nations so you don't have to, and I hate that expression, and I used it on purpose to call it out because there's so many things. I read this so you didn't have to. I watched this so you didn't have to. Well, why? Why do I want to accept someone on the internet who I've never met, their interpretation of something, their summary of something, rather than to digest it for myself and form my own independent thoughts? But this is where we have devolved to as a society, is just find the person who says, I read it so you don't have to. I watched it so you don't have to. I know it's a very big book. I'm looking at it right now. It's in front of me. I bought it years ago. And yes, I have read it. It's like 1,200 pages. No, it's more than 1,200 pages. Hold on. Up to the appendix, including the introduction. It's over 1,200 pages. It's a big book. It's a lot. Adam Smith had a lot of words within him that he needed to get out. And there's an introduction written by Alan B. Kruger that gives some really good insight in his own interpretation and opinion. But let's talk about it. The Wealth of Nations. This is what capitalism is based on. This is what capitalist philosophy is based on. Let me rephrase that. If you have spent any time in political circles, particularly conservative political circles, you've heard about the invisible hand. It is, out of those 1,200 plus pages, it is a blip in this book. Now, it is an overarching theory of the book, but it is mentioned exactly one time in the entire book. Just once. And I'm going to read you the passage. I'm going to read you more than just the small passage. I'm going to start 3 paragraphs. Before, 2 paragraphs before he mentions it. If you have the paperback version like I do from Bantam Classic Publishers, it's on page 572. The produce of industry is what it adds to the subject or materials upon which it is employed, in proportion as the value of this produce is great or small, so will likewise be the profits of the employer. But it is only for the sake of profit that any man employs a capital, 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 in the support of industry. And he will always, therefore, endeavor to employ it in the support of that industry of which the produce is likely to be of the greatest value, or to exchange for the greatest quantity either of money or of other goods. But the annual revenue of every society is always precisely equal to the exchangeable value of the whole annual produce of its industry, or rather, is precisely the same thing that with that exchangeable value. As every individual, therefore, endeavors as much as he can both to employ his capital in the support of domestic industry, and so to direct that industry that its produce may be of the greatest value, every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. By preferring the support of domestic to that of foreign industry, he intends only his own security, and by directing that industry in such a manner as its produce may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. And he is, in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. Nor is it always the worse for the society that it was no part of it. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. It is an affectation, indeed, not very common among merchants, and very few words need to be employed in dissuading them from it. In other writings and discourse, people have elucidated that Adam Smith meant by his invisible hand the work of God. That God was essentially directing the economy. Now, those are people's speculations and elaborations from interviews. You can take that with however big a grain of salt that you want to. But the majority of evangelical conservatives take it as gospel, and it is understood that what Adam Smith put forth in The Wealth of Nations was the idea that God is in control of the economy if you let him be. If you try to get government involved, if you try to orchestrate it in some way, as that paragraph mentioned about doing things for the public good, it's gonna mess it up. You have to just let the free market take its course, and God will direct things as they are supposed to be. Now, there are a lot of conservatives who read The Wealth of Nations and took it as greater than the Bible, people who are not religious or agnostic or at least not Christian, and a lot of these people call themselves Goldwater conservatives. Another good read, The Conscience of a Conservative, written by Barry Goldwater, another book that I read a long time ago, details a much more libertarian ideology. Libertarian with a little L, not a capital L. That's a subject for another day. But I will briefly state that the Libertarian Party and libertarian ideology are two different things. And if someone calls themselves a small L libertarian, no, they probably are not aligned with the Libertarian Party. And they are more in alignment with what is called a Goldwater conservative. So, going back to The Wealth of Nations, there's an introduction to this book in my copy written by Alan B. Kruger, who I will confess I know nothing about. However, in this introduction, he makes a point that I have underlined because I think it's worth noting if you're looking into what Adam Smith said about the invisible hand. And in my copy of this, again, this is beginning on page 16 of the introduction. He states probably the most famous and selectively cited passage in The Wealth of Nations concerns Smith's reference to the invisible hand. This reference occurs only once in the book, toward the end of the following paragraph on page 572, and then he quotes that passage. And then he says, Smith's specific point is that restrictions on imports, supported by merchants and manufacturers in some industries, work to the advantage of those industries, but not to the general good of society. I wanted to read that to you because Smith was making the point specifically that things like tariffs are not good for society as a whole. While they may benefit specific manufacturers or business people, they do not benefit society as a whole. In fact, they do the opposite. And I think that's worthy of note because what I see today, as someone who was a staunch conservative, is a movement within the right wing, the Republican Party, that is anything but conservative from the philosophical aspect of what being conservative means. And let's dive into that a little more because it gets deeper. And it gets very esoteric when you really dive into it in a very weird way that I never expected to see as I started diving into it for this episode. So, why is it that you see this just almost inseparable cohesion between capitalism and the evangelical Christian nationalist movement? What is it? Why did they come together? Well, part of it is what I mentioned before. The invisible hand is God. Capitalism is the only way to let God do his work. If you're using any other economical system, you are trying to do God's work. You are not trusting God. You're getting in his way. You're trusting man over God, and you just shouldn't do that. There's that part of it. And I'm throwing that out there like it's just kind of haphazard, but those are literally the philosophies that I heard preached. But it took another level during the Reagan era. The Reagan era was just like the Christian nationalists' rocket launch point, as I view it. I'm not saying it didn't exist before, but Reagan empowered evangelical conservatives in a way that they had never felt empowered before. It was when the homeschool movement took root. It was when it became synonymous to be conservative and to be Christian. When the Christian nationalist movements, it really started with saying, well, you're not really Christian if you vote Democrat. How could you vote for a Democrat? They believe in abortion. That was when that movement really took off. And granted, this was just a few short years after Roe v. Wade was passed. And so that was a very emotionally charged issue, as I've talked about in previous episodes. And so it kind of galvanized that base into, okay, well, here we see this evil moral issue. Who is it that's fighting against it? It's certainly not the Democrats. How can you call yourself a Christian and vote for a Democrat? How can you support them when they are so obviously opposed to the true word of God? And so being a Republican became synonymous with being a Christian in a lot of circles. And I'm not saying everyone, and I'm not saying that it was 100%, but this is where we get this idea that we have today, this Christian nationalist movement of you're not really a Christian, you're not a good one anyway, unless you're voting Republican and supporting Republican candidates. And in very politically involved circles, that got down to primary elections and the grassroots movements. And, well, how could you support that Republican? He's pro-choice. How could you support that Republican? He's a Mormon. He's not a real Christian. These are things that I heard said. And the Christian nationalist movement that became so entrenched and empowered during the Reagan era, it was mostly over social issues. But the economic issues were their driving points. Now, abortion is always going to be their number one issue because it's way too emotional for them to get rid of it as an issue. You can't not use that as an issue if you're in politics because it's so emotionally charged on both sides. You're going to just completely separate your bases with that argument. And it is politically prudent to use it because people don't see beyond it. They just get really emotional about that issue and become single issue voters and won't look at anything else. It's a very intelligent political tactic that we have fallen for years on both sides. From the right wing going, I couldn't vote for anyone who's for murdering babies, to the left wing going, I couldn't vote for anyone who thinks that my daughter doesn't deserve rights. We just missed the whole point of everything and fell for a manipulative tactic. And I'm talking about campaign promises and campaign ideologies, not laws being passed. But it's a manipulative tactic that's used every single election, and we fall for it every year. And it began in the Reagan era. That was when that started, and we have consistently fallen for it every single election cycle, and no one has ever stopped to say, does this seem weird to y'all that they keep using this against us and nothing is really fundamentally changing one way or the other? Now, I will grant you that since the most recent presidential election, there have been a lot of things changing, mostly outside of the way that the law is supposed to work. But that's another subject. Getting back to the economy. Once capitalism became the only moral economic system, the only biblical economic system, even though the Bible doesn't really talk about an economic system as far as which one is more pleasing to God or not. Side note on that, I do find it funny, and I did even before I became liberal, that people who believe in an all-powerful God think that God can be limited by the actions of men. I mean, either he is all-powerful or he's not. There's not an in-between. To say that he can't do what he needs to do and can't help us how he needs to help us if we have a certain form of government or economic system in place, that's somehow going to limit him, is to deny him being all-powerful. But that's a subject for discussing with your friend who thinks that capitalism is the only biblical system. Not really worth talking about on this podcast today. So once we've decided that capitalism is the only biblical system and the only one that a Christian can support, and that everything else is a denial of God's power or a reliance on men to support you in some way, whether it's, socialism or communism or whatever, that everything else is just relying on men instead of God, then we get down into the personal aspect of it. And the morality of poverty. Or more accurately, in how it's viewed within the church, the immorality of poverty. And this begins with blaming whoever is poor for being poor. Well, it's because you made poor choices. You chose to have kids, or you chose to marry that guy, or you chose to not marry that guy, or you chose to get this job instead of, going to school, or you chose to leave your parents' home and now you've had to start from scratch and are trying to make ends meet, but you're working at McDonald's and you don't have an education yet, and so that's all you got, or at least all that you think that you've got, and that's the only option that you know that you have. Well, this all sounds like your fault. You're poor because you made bad choices. Maybe you should go back to your abusive parents, or maybe you should marry that guy that was giving you serial killer vibes, and then you wouldn't be poor. So we're not going to help you out because you made your choices, and that's why you're where you are. I don't care that Jesus said to help the poor. You're poor because you chose to be, and Jesus didn't say to help you. I mean, that's not true. Jesus never said, ask people why they're poor before you help them. Jesus never said, ask people why they don't have money for food before you feed them. Or ask people why they don't have shelter before you take them in. He just said to be kind to people. To feed those who are hungry and take care of those who are sick and look out for the widows and the orphans. But it's a lot easier to judge the widows and the orphans and the hungry and the sick and decide that they're in the situation they're in because of their own choices than it is to just help them. One of the most insidious arguments that I heard, and it was one of the most common arguments that I heard about those who were poor, was that we shouldn't help them because poverty makes you rely on God. That it would be immoral for us to take that away, that they have a lesson that they're supposed to be learning. God is teaching them a lesson, putting them through a trial. He's trying to bring them closer to Him. So if we just give them food or clothes or whatever it is that they need, money, well, and they're not going to rely on God. And if we have any social programs in place, they're just going to trust the government instead of God. And that's why social programs shouldn't be in place, because it teaches people to trust the government instead of God, and it's evil. Truly, in the entire argument about those who are impoverished, the only thing that was consistent is that what those who are impoverished really need is the gospel, because they're sinners. As are we all, but they're for sure sinners, or they wouldn't be so poor. And so they need the gospel. They need us to teach them the gospel. And, you can put out a meal or something to draw them in so you can teach them the gospel. That's what Jesus did, after all. Look at how he fed the 5,000 and everything. That was just to draw them in so he could preach the gospel. And that's really all they need. Once they have the gospel, then they can pray and God will help them because they're good. And if He doesn't, it's because He needs them to go through a trial to help them be stronger and to rely on Him more and to trust Him more. And this is their entire idea about poverty and wealth, that if you are extremely wealthy, it's because God blessed you. And if you're poor, it's because God's trying to get your attention. He's testing you. Or you just made poor choices and got yourself in that mess. It is prosperity gospel without all of the witchcraft that isn't witchcraft added into it. And certainly, certain denominations like to bring that part into it. All you got to do is pray and you'll get whatever you want. I mean, that's manifestation, but okay. there is this idea within the evangelical church that poverty is either a punishment or an attention getter, and it should not be alleviated by Christians. This is not in the Bible. I want to make that point as strongly as I can. I've read the entire Bible multiple times. I was steeped in this doctrine. The idea that poverty is a punishment or God testing you is nowhere in the Bible. Not in any of the books, New Testament or Old. It is fabricated by American evangelicals, and I'm not going to give them that much credit that it originated with them, because it originated before them and they adopted it from another, and it originated before that one and adopted it from another. It is in the Bible as a condemnation. This is what the Pharisees believe. This is what Jesus called out the Pharisees for. One of the many things Jesus called out the Pharisees for is that they believed that if you're rich, you're a good person. God's blessed you. If you're poor, God's punishing you. This is a Pharisaical belief. Jesus called out the Pharisees for their hypocrisy and for their lack of adherence to God's word and spirituality. But this is what the American evangelical church has adopted as one of its core beliefs. It's really interesting to me not being in the church anymore and not being conservative anymore, to look at this movement almost from an outside perspective. And I remember it might have been the Young America's Foundation. I used to go to that conference every year. I think I went 3 years in a row. It's a conservative organization that's for college students to help them be active on campus and to encourage political involvement. I got to meet some really famous people because of that conference, and for what it is, I have to say it is really good. I don't agree with their ideology anymore at all, but it was a really well put together conference, and for a college student, it's a really cool experience, and really motivating to actually get involved in politics. So I have a hard time being disparaging against it, even though I don't agree with their politics anymore. But I think it was at one of those conferences, there was a speaker who was talking about liberals and conservatives and changing things, making like big changes for a difference. And he said, conservatives will always try to maintain the status quo. That is what it means, conserve. That's what we do. That is the point. You maintain the status quo. You elect or appoint a conservative judge. They're going to uphold the things that are already in place. They're going to maintain what is already there. Liberals are trying to shake things up. Liberals are trying to advance and change things and take us in another direction. And it's so interesting to me as I've dabbled a little in studying Egyptian esotericism and the Egyptian mythology and this dichotomy of chaos and order within the Egyptian religious system. The idea that there are these deities that are devoted to keeping order, and there are these deities that are devoted to chaos. And chaos is the energy where creation happens, the creation of the world, the creation of life, growth, change. Order is maintenance. And it's interesting to look at that because you look at this just constant in America. Since the foundation, we have had this dichotomy because we allowed a dichotomy of ideology, this fighting between order and chaos. It's spiritual, and not in a way that we think of this spiritual battle and Satan's coming and Jesus is coming back and all of this, but it is a spiritual battle in the sense that this is the way that the world has always been. Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. This is the same thing. It was there in Egypt. It's the same energy. It is the same vibration. We've just dressed it up in suits and ties and put it in a fancy building in our capital. This is the fight between order and chaos. Are we going to make something new? Or are we going to maintain the status quo? And it's really interesting looking at it now because the right wing has swapped from being the conservatives, those maintaining order, to being chaos. It is absolute chaos right now. And the liberals, the Democrats, have taken the maintenance, the order side of things, but they're not fighting for it. They're shooting water pistols at it. And so we have this huge movement that has been empowered that was previously the conservative, the maintenance, the order party. Suddenly they've swapped and they're the chaos party, and they have turned everything upside down on its head. And the party that was for chaos, that was such a calm chaos, though, let's change things a little bit. Let's peaceful transitions and all of this. Suddenly they have been shoved to the other side to be forced to advocate for order, and they don't know how to because they never have before. They have been the party that is fighting for change, and now they're having to try to fight for everything staying the same as it was, and they don't know how to. But this faction of the order party, which is what I'm going to call them, has been quietly lying dormant and growing for decades, waiting for their moment to rise and do exactly what is happening now. Let's make radical change. And they have enough money, and they have enough seats, and they have enough judges, and they have control of the executive branch to where they are going largely unchecked because those who could check them were so blindsided and so unprepared, they're standing with their mouths agape, having no idea what to do. I am very socially liberal. Now, I am a lot more economically conservative. However, I consider myself to be an economic realist. In a society as big as ours, there is not a chance for equality and the equitable division of resources without government intervention. There's just not. There has to be government intervention in some way, or people are going to be exploited. Now, Are we doing that? Absolutely not. Have we ever done that? Not that I know of. But this is why I support government programs and things. I think things like WIC and Social Security are helpful if they are carried out effectively. Not saying that they ever have been carried out effectively, but I think that they are a step in the right direction. And I think that ending them abruptly without any stopgap measure or any way to ensure that people are taken care of is irresponsible, first of all, and cruel and immoral, second of all. I am watching everything that is happening with Doge, and it is the opposite of fiscal conservative policies and actions. I've been a fiscal conservative for a long time, pretty much my whole life. I never really stopped being a fiscal conservative, even when I became much more socially liberal. I never stopped being a fiscal conservative. I think that the government should be much more conservative in how they spend their money. I think they should be cautious in it. I just have a fundamental disagreement with most conservatives about what that means, because they think spending tons of money, billions and billions of dollars on bolstering our military and sending men and women off to foreign fields just so we can show that we're there is irresponsible. I think that it is a waste of taxpayer money. I think that it is a reason why we are so hated throughout the world. And I think we shouldn't do it. I think we should save ourselves money and keep our people at home instead of trying to show force throughout the entire world so everyone knows how big and bad we are. But most conservatives will tell you we need military force. We need that spending. We need those bases throughout the world. Why? So people know we're tough. I have not seen anything even closely related to an elimination of wasteful spending come from Doge's actions. I have seen extremely unethical behavior. I've seen the illegal seizure of private information from citizens to a private citizen's account. He's appointed, not elected. There's a difference. He is a bureaucrat. That's what an appointed position is. He's a bureaucrat. If Nancy down at City Hall took all of the city taxpayers' social security numbers and bank account information and addresses and all of their personal information and saved it on her personal hard drive, would you think that was acceptable? Would you think that was legal? That she was acting within her bounds? Well, she's supposed to be working on the budget and finding the wasteful spending. What does that have to do with that? Now Nancy went and took $5,000 out of somebody's bank account because she decided that they were dead, even though they weren't. But based on her records, they had to be dead, so she took $5,000 out of their bank account because she decided that was the back money that was owed. But they weren't dead, and that money was given to them legally. And now they can't pay for their medication because Nancy just decided to take that money from them. This is what is happening. This is what Elon Musk is doing. I'm probably more fiscally conservative than most of the people who have been arguing with me about fiscal conservatism and government waste. You don't know what government waste is. I've listened to your arguments. You have no idea. I could have a conversation with you about it. I could pick things that need to be cut better than Elon Musk has, and I don't even have access to the records that he does. And I still don't support what he's doing because I haven't seen anything that is eliminating government waste or wasteful spending. I haven't seen anything that benefits the taxpayers. I've seen a shit ton that benefits Elon Musk. I've watched my president illegally use his office to advertise for Elon Musk's company. Yes, by the way, that is illegal, to use the office to advertise for a private business. But that doesn't bother anybody. We're so conservative, but it's fine to use the office of the president to advertise for a private company. And no one gets the oligarchical nature of what is happening right now because no one studied politics. You all slept through your poli-sci courses that you had to do for your gen eds in college. None of you were paying attention to your history lessons in high school and college. That's my degree before I was a nurse. I have a degree in poli-sci. I worked with the government. Within the government. I worked with a legislator, writing and researching legislation. I was a political activist doing grassroots work, both on the campaign trail and with nonprofit organizations. And people who have barely, if ever, been involved in politics in their entire lives are trying to lecture me about the economy and politics like they have some kind of special knowledge while ignoring what is happening. And I just went on that rant because I'm so tired of being told you sound angry. I am angry. If you were in my situation, you would also be angry. And if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. If you're not angry, you have your head buried in the sand. If you're not angry, it's because you have chosen to not be informed. You have chosen to check out from society. You have chosen to ignore what is going on. I am angry. Anger is a really good motivator for change. I know a lot of people are feeling absolute despair and depression and despondency and overwhelm with everything that's happening and feel like they don't know what to do. So here's my advice that no one asked for on what to do. Number one is get educated, and that does not mean follow good news sources. It means read a fucking book. It means read from credible sources what is actually happening. Look at, it's called the Doge Counter, I think. I'll post a link on my Facebook and my Instagram. Look at what Elon Musk's actual spending counts are, because he's claiming one thing. He claimed $105 billion in saved money, wasteful spending he'd found. It's like, I think the number that I saw was 29 billion. No, it had to be less than that because maybe it was 29 million, because what he claimed and what he found, there was, like, what he claimed was like 92%, and what he actually found was like the 8%. Pi Day was several days ago. I quit mathing then. Anyway, the second thing is to get understanding and empathy. I don't care what side of the aisle you are on. I am exhausted with watching this liberal versus conservative, right versus left, Democrat versus Republican fight. Y'all are exhausting. It was exhausting when I was on the right. It's exhausting when I'm on the left. I'm so tired of people who absolutely refuse to look at their neighbor who thinks differently than them and try to find any kind of common ground. This is why we are in the situation we're in, because the right hand side is going, they're moral reprobates. I won't have anything to do with them. And the left-hand side that claims to be so empathetic and understanding and inclusive looks at them and goes, well, they're just hateful bigots. I'm not going to have anything to do with them. I won't talk to them even. And so everyone is fighting each other in the streets, and everyone in power is laughing because they don't have to worry about anyone who they're getting money and power from looking at them at all because they're too busy fighting their neighbor. So have a conversation with somebody who thinks differently than you. Like an actual conversation, not let me try to convince you. Let me understand you. And do you want to understand me? Because we all just want the same thing. We just want to be able to live our lives and take care of our families and ourselves. And do the things that make us happy. That's it. That's what we all want. Boiled down to a nutshell. We have different ideas of what that looks like, but that's what we all want. And if we'd sit down and find that common ground with each other and stop fighting our neighbors, we could take this chaos and create something actually good. And so my last piece of advice is to get involved. All politics is local. This was a thing that little catchphrase that was said constantly when I was working in politics. All politics is local. So if you're not going to your city council or county commission meetings, if the mayor doesn't know your name, if your county commissioner doesn't know who you are, you're not involved enough. You gotta start local. Start with where you live. And talk to your representatives at the state level and representatives and senators at state level, at the national level. They should know you too. That's what they're there to do, is to represent you. That's their job. If you're not talking to them, then they're only representing their own interests. Hold them accountable. Make them represent yours. That's what you elected them to do. And my final piece of advice is don't give up. Because if you give up, then they've won. And I don't think anyone wants that. I don't think that allowing them to win is the way to fix anything. And with all of the horrors going on in the world, why would we let them just take over? And I've mentioned it on another episode, but I keep thinking about this quote from the Tank Girl comic book. She said, "I can't let things be this way. We can be wonderful. We can be magnificent. We can turn this shit around." And I think about that every single day. And we can. So let's turn this shit around. And join me next week on the podcast as we both continue to work on our mosaic in progress. I love you all. I hope you are well. I hope you are taking care of yourselves. We're going to get through this together. Lead with your heart. And you'll never go wrong.